Hello, my name is Helen Hope Kimbrough, and I'm a board member with the Library Foundation, and I would like to welcome you to tonight's final Draught Home Edition with award-winning author Patrice Gopo. So welcome everyone. We've had 5 great weeks of connecting readers and writers through these events, and tonight is our final Draught Home Edition episode. A reminder that Park Road Books and Main Street Books are happy to help you with book purchases while we're staying home tonight. You can also order all the colors we will see online, and it will be shipped to your home. It's available for digital download through the library's Hoopla access. Also, the library offers all the colors we will see in a book club kit that can be checked out when libraries reopen. This is a great resource, 10 books, a discussion guide, and more that can be checked out for those of you with book clubs. I would also like to shout out Town Brewing. Normally we hold Final Draught there, but in the meantime, check them out for your growler and a bite to eat. At this juncture, I would like to introduce Patrice Gopo, the author of All the Colors We Will See. Patrice Gopo was born and raised in Anchorage, Alaska, and she is the child of Jamaican immigrants. Her writing often considers racial identity formation, race relations, and the search for a sense of belonging. Her essays have appeared in a variety of publications, including Catapult, Creative Nonfiction, and online in the New York Times and the Washington Post. She is the recipient of a North Carolina Arts Council Literature Fellowship, and her essay collection, All the Colors We Will See, was a fall 2018 Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers selection. When she's not writing, she's enjoying time speaking to groups about the power of personal storytelling. She lives in Charlotte with her family. Welcome, Patrice. I'm so excited to moderate this conversation with you tonight. How are you?
Thanks so much for having me here, Helen. It really is a pleasure to be here, and I'm just excited to be part of what the Library Foundation is doing because you guys, I miss the library a lot right now.
Oh, I'm sure you do. What is your favorite part about the library?
I mean, I think my personal favorite part is just when I show up and there's my holds are all there, and so I get to leave with my stacks of books. So I
Yes,
miss that.
yes.
But just also, I think just being in the library, I know my girls enjoy going, and
Mhm.
I think as many writers would, I have many fond memories of experiences around libraries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel the same way that you do. I mean, from a little girl, libraries have always been a part of my life,
Right. Right.
and checking out books and even just feeling and touching the books that are there
I
um,
agree.
have always been instrumental for me. So I couldn't agree with you more. Plus, I also like the children's programming that they have there.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I know. So I'm excited to moderate this conversation. And you know, I had to grab my copy
Absolutely.
of the book, All the Colors We Will See, that you actually signed for me. So, can you tell me a little bit about All the Colors We Will See?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned a little bit when you introduced me that I am the child of Jamaican immigrants. I grew up in Anchorage, Alaska. And so, really, I feel like that story of my experience growing up as the Black American daughter of Jamaican immigrants in Anchorage, Alaska, it forms the basis for this book. It's a collection of essays. And I feel that within these essays grouped together, they're really telling my story and my experience of what it means to be a Black woman in this society where we're very intent on classifying people and defining experiences based on what people look like. So I feel that it's really just my offering to our particular times of this experience of what it was like for me to live here, to grow up here, to now be making my way out there in the world in our
Hmm.
country.
And I would also like for you to just reflect on, because that's the title, but it also has a subtitle to it,
Right,
about reflections on barriers and brokenness and finding our way. And
right.
even during the midst of what is going on now, where we are sheltering in place, all of
Mhm.
us literally are trying to find our way once again. So could you
Right.
expound upon that as well?
Absolutely. I think that's a great question because I feel that the subtitle really captures this idea that brokenness exists in our world. There are things that don't work the ways we would hope they would work. There are things that fall short of what we dreamed they would be. And when we add this idea of barriers to it, I think the reality is that brokenness is not impacting everyone in the same fashion. That because of past injustices and hierarchies that we have present in our world, that in fact, some of these experiences with brokenness are also related to barriers that people are finding in their lives. And so I do delve into some of that a little bit, whether it might be barriers related to race or barriers related to experiences of being a woman. I just want to bring those things to light that it's true that we are all grappling with brokenness, but I think
Mhm.
it's not necessarily always the same for everyone. And I think that's becoming very clear even as we consider what's happening in our current situation, that
Mhm.
this pandemic that has swept our world is not impacting everyone in the same form or fashion, that there are communities that are suffering more because of historical injustice that has been experienced by people, that has been inflicted upon others. And so I think that's part of what I hope comes through with this idea of barriers, brokenness, and the part about finding our way. I think that speaks to this idea that I do believe that the things we long for could be possible. I believe that. I like to say that I write with a redemptive arc. And I think
Mhm.
there's that idea conveyed with finding our way, that somewhere out there, I think it's possible that we could find our way in the midst of these things that we experience, these struggles that we live through.
Mhm. I wholeheartedly agree, and I wholeheartedly understand the disparities that you speak of, even when it comes to social distancing as well. Like,
Absolutely.
social distancing, from articles that I've read, it really is a privilege.
Right.
And
Yes.
sometimes we don't see it as that,
Right.
but really is the stance regarding it. So I
Right.
always like to have that conversation prefaced with that.
It is, right. I think it's so very true. And I think in this way, I talk about how, as I've written this book, I have shared my particular story. I've added my experience and my voice to the larger narrative that plays out in our world. And I think when I consider what happens in these particular days and ages, that it's really important that many voices are able to offer their stories because the experiences are not uniform. And just
Mhm.
like what you shared, and I think as people share stories,
Mhm.
part of how we as a society can seek to better understand one another and
Mhm.
seek to recognize the presence of injustice so that we can work to do something about that.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. Well, I'm going to switch up just a little bit because I'm sure many don't know that you have an engineering background.
Yes, I do. Yeah.
I knew that just because you and I, we've connected in,
Mhm.
different facets. But I would like to know, how did engineering help prepare you for writing? Or
That's a
did,
great question. Yes, and I absolutely think that they're connected. It's true what you
Mhm.
said. A lot of people don't realize that my undergraduate degree is in chemical engineering. So I took a circuitous path to get into the
Mhm.
writing life. But I did start working as an engineer. I worked at the company Eastman Kodak for a couple years after I graduated. And one of the things that I like to think about related to engineering is I think we often like to draw divides between creativity and technical. And I think there's actually a lot of space where these things actually overlap. And so I feel as though the engineering mindset that I developed actually lends itself very well to creativity, because I believe that engineering is a lot about thinking through problems, looking for creative solutions. And I think that shows up in writing so much, Helen. When I think about
Yeah.
working on an essay
Yeah.
and the ways in which I just stay curious about what might be happening in the world. And then as I'm putting the pieces together for this essay and thinking, well, does that quite make sense? Maybe there's another solution here. I need to look at this from another angle. And I feel as though that's the engineering mindset I bring to writing that
Hmm.
infuses my words with something that I think would be missing if I hadn't
Hmm.
experienced this particular background and had this
Hmm.
particular time of, delving in this other space.
Hmm. Yeah, I find it fascinating. And I also, and speaking about engineering, and there's an essay that you wrote called Role Model or Black Girls May Have Dreamed of Engineering Because of Women Like Me. And
Yes.
in this essay, you make an apology for not staying in the engineering field, for
Right.
not acting as an example for young girls. So,
Yes.
how do you see your title of writer fulfilling that role?
Yeah, well, I have a short passage from that section of the essay. So why don't I just read that short passage first, and then I'll circle back to the question.
Okay.
So this is from that same essay that you just mentioned, role model. The end was inevitable, the exact time not so certain. So, what I want to say to the little girls I once tutored while I was in college, and to the ones who sat with me in the basement of a church, and the ones who stopped at my table and listened to me explain the primary colors of light, to those girls who looked at me, looked at my complexion, and saw a picture of what they could become, and maybe even more so to the girls who never saw me, heard me, and thus never imagined. To all of you, what I want to say is, I'm sorry I left. I'm sorry I didn't stay. I was born into this particular moment in time, in this particular place. Not 40 years before or 400 years before, not 40 years after or 400 years after, but now. And at this particular moment in time, in this particular place, for women and girls like me, I recognize my pursuits as not divorced from the eyes of others looking for an example of what they might become. So that's from the essay, and that's the apology
Yeah.
that you were speaking of. And for me, it's really rooted in this idea that I recognize there are not a lot of Black women who pursue engineering, and that we have a serious shortage of examples
Mhm.
and role models in that field.
Mhm.
I felt that myself when I was studying engineering. And so, in a way, I think I carried with me this sense of responsibility that I could serve as that example for others. And I already was doing that. And so I think, in a way, to have let go of that career, it almost felt a bit as though I was failing these young girls, young Black girls,
Mhm.
failing young women in my community to have picked a different path. And yet at the same time, I recognize as well that writing, it was calling to me. It was
Mhm.
asking me to come follow it. And
Mhm.
I think there's something there as well that can be a powerful example of also finding the courage to step
Yes.
out and try something different, to
Yeah.
pursue something so unrelated to what seemingly unrelated to what you
Mhm.
studied before. And so in that regard, I I think there's a tension that exists,
Mhm.
and it's okay that there's this part of me that maybe regrets a little bit. I'm raising daughters myself, and I sometimes think, oh, you're not really seeing your mother do that, and yet at the same
Mhm.
time, but you're seeing this other aspect, and so maybe
Yeah.
we all can work together to
Oh,
still
yeah.
to speak into people's lives as well.
Yeah, and they can actually see this other side of you, which is creative and robust, and starting with something from scratch and also growing that,
Absolutely.
which I think
Absolutely.
is phenomenal. And you're an acclaimed writer, so they got a chance to see that as well.
Right. No, I think you're right. I think the reality is there there's always going to be some of this tension back and forth, and yet I think we can still rest in the decisions that we've made
Hmm.
and embrace them as good and powerful and encouraging. So,
Yes. Well, we do have some questions that are coming in.
oh,
Uh,
okay. Great.
so I would like to ask a few of these. Uh,
Absolutely.
this question is from Kama. If we are not a writer, how else can we share our stories?
Oh, I love this question. This is one thing I do because this is one thing that I love to think about is the importance of sharing stories. And I like to say to people, I shared my story in a book, but we
Hmm.
all have stories to tell. And I think it's important that we find spaces in which we can encourage storytelling and sharing. And so, one of the things that I think is important is for us to first own that reality that we do
Hmm.
all have stories. I think our society has unfortunately done a really good job of acting as though there's a hierarchy of value of stories and indicating that certain people's stories are more important. And I just
Hmm.
push back against that. So I think one of the beginning things is for us to just embrace this reality that actually my story is important too. My story matters as well. And I think once we can begin to do that, I think we then start to build spaces, whether gathering around the dinner table and intentionally looking to share experiences and ask questions that might bring out more stories from people, creating safe spaces where people can do that. I think
Hmm.
just sharing, telling stories, I think in many ways is something we don't spend as much time on as maybe we might have done at other points in our life or maybe in history in the past. I'm not sure. But I think that's another idea of thinking about what it would look like to be intentional about drawing out people's stories and speaking stories and even just gathering together and let's pick a topic and share a story about that. The Charlotte Center for the Literary Arts, Charlotte Lit, they
Hmm.
had a
Oh, yeah.
neat program about, I guess it was January of 2019 called the Beautiful Truth Initiative. And I,
I love that program.
yes,
Yes,
great.
yes.
I had
We
the,
reconnected again during
that's
that.
right, we sure did. And the library worked with it and everything. And I had the privilege of writing the curriculum for that. And part of that was giving people some prompts in which to
Hmm.
think about their own stories and then to share them or then tell
Hmm.
them. It wasn't just about you had to write them. And I will just say, if anyone, I think some of that information is still out there in the library
Hmm.
archives if anyone is interested in finding out more about it. But
Okay.
that's a great question. And I just, again, want to reiterate I really believe we all have stories and they don't have to show up in a book, that we don't have to be a writer to share those.
Hmm. Now, Jenny asked, what brought you to Alaska?
Yes, absolutely. So I actually was born and raised in Alaska. My parents are the ones who ended up coming to Alaska. And so I talk about this a little bit in my book. It was
Hmm.
actually one of the stories I felt like I needed to get out very quickly in the book because there were going to be questions about how that happened. But as it turns out, my father, when he was a teenager, he moved from Jamaica. So he emigrated from Jamaica and immigrated to the United States. And he was living in New York City at the time. So he graduated from high school there. And then after high school, it was during the time of the Vietnam War, and he received a draft notice, and he was drafted into the
Hmm.
army. And after his basic training was done, he and one other guy, let me say this again, everyone else except for him and one other guy were actually sent to Vietnam. And he doesn't remember where the other guy went, but he was sent to Alaska. And
Wow.
that was the beginning of our family's story in
Hmm.
in Alaska.
Now, are people always surprised that you grew up in Alaska? I mean, can you talk about the landscape a little bit to give us some description about Alaska?
Sure, absolutely. So to answer both of those questions, I
Mhm.
would say across my life, it has always, when I'm not in Alaska, it has always been a point of interest when people discover that. So I think there's multiple things that go through people's minds. There is
Mhm.
certainly just thinking about the distance. I've often heard I've never met anyone from there before. And then I think
Mhm.
there's a question of how many Black people are up in Alaska. So there's lots of
Mhm.
questions that come. So I think it certainly does draw its own point of interest. But in terms of thinking about my experience, I grew up in Anchorage. So Anchorage it's the largest city in
Mhm.
Alaska. And I mean, it's not as large as Charlotte, certainly, but it's, populated city, maybe 600,000
Mhm.
people living there. But where I grew up, there was actually like mountains, a mountain backdrop behind
Mhm.
the area where I grew up. So that's one thing I feel very strongly attached to is the presence of mountains because it really speaks to me of home. And I've noticed
Mhm.
even here in North Carolina that my family and we often enjoy just going to the mountains. And I think there's something that makes me feel maybe a deeper connection to myself and my soul.
Yeah.
And
Oh, I'm sure.
so
Mhm.
I think there's definitely that. And there was a lot of just being part of the natural world was part of my childhood experience, whether just playing in the woods around our house or going salmon fishing in the summertime. So that was a lot of my
Mhm.
experience as well.
Awesome. So you are getting quite a few questions here that I want to continue to ask.
Okay, absolutely.
Um, so Zalinda notes she's a powerful example or a comment that demonstrates a multifaceted woman. So
That's nice.
kudos to you with that. Thank you so much for your comments, Alinda.
Yes,
And
thanks.
then Nina J asked, what kind of questions can we ask to elicit stories from others?
Absolutely. So one of the questions I have actually started asking with friends recently in this just this year as I was trying to think how can I more intentionally go about
Mhm.
doing this is I've been asking a series of questions that include things like how do you feel that you've changed in the last 6 months? What might be different about you today than you were 6 months ago? I've asked what feels hard about life right now. What do you feel is bringing you joy right now? So I think there's been an intentionality with which I've been just trying to ask questions, but I also think there's other ways. So when I think about that beautiful truth curriculum that I developed,
Mhm.
there were some activities around thinking about your name. What might be the
Mhm.
story of your name? Or thinking about your place of origin. What might be
Mhm.
your place of origin? Just kind of thinking about the different things that form us and create us and make us who we are. And I think uh, intentionally trying to draw those out and ask people. I do want to just say, though, as we're thinking about asking or creating space for stories, I think it's also important that we recognize it's important that people feel a sense of safety as we're creating these spaces
Yes.
for
Yes.
stories. We don't want to ever put people in positions where they feel like they have to share something if they're not
Mhm.
comfortable sharing something. So I think that also needs to be in our minds as we're working to try and
Mhm.
hear people's experiences and hear
Mhm.
people's stories.
Yeah. And, embrace those stories
Right.
and be appreciative that they shared the stories
Right.
too,
Yes. I
and
think
what those stories are.
absolutely. That's one thing that I feel strongly about when I'm teaching classes, teaching writing classes. So I do teach classes about writing. And when people share something, because I teach creative nonfiction, so people are sharing from their lives. And when they share something, they read something, I think it's very valuable that we thank the person for having done that, that we thank them. And that's something I learned from local writer and teacher, Maureen Ryan Griffin. And
Mhm.
I took a class with her many years ago, and that was always her method of how we
Mhm.
share things, that we thank people afterwards.
Oh, yeah, definitely so. Now, here's a question from Lenny. How else has seeing yourself as a role model for young Black women changed you or your decisions?
So I would say, I think there's just a sense of awareness. I think that's
Mhm.
the big thing that I feel. And I think at this juncture in my life, it's not necessarily always that that determines what I might
Mhm.
do or what my decisions are. But I do think what I feel and what I wanted to communicate in that particular essay that I shared was just that sense of awareness of my decisions having larger impact beyond just my own personal experience and what I might be doing. And so that I think is the big thing that is part of my experience as a
Mhm.
woman in our world.
Mhm. Now, in your book, All the Colors We Will See, what do you hope readers will take from the book? What do you hope they gain from the book?
Absolutely. Yeah. So when I think about what it is I long for people to gain, when I think about people who maybe share much of my experience, my deep desire is for them to see their story in a way reflected in my experience.
Mhm.
To see that, yes, stories like our stories, complicated stories around identity and
Mhm.
racial identity formation and just all these many layers, these many colors of who we are. These types of stories are important and valuable contributions to our world. So I hope that people would gain that. And I think for people who may enter this story and see it as something very different from their own experience, something that maybe is not like what they've experienced in life, that my hope and desire is that they would recognize and find that there are points of connection between my experience and their experience, even if it's not visible right away, that they would find those moments of connection. And those moments of connection would actually then enable them to enter more fully into the story, to recognize and see the ways in which we are different and we're not experiencing life in the same way. I think sometimes we want to reduce things to say, oh, well, we have this in common. So it's almost like we're this.
Yeah.
But actually, that's really not what it is. But I think the commonalities actually become the invitation to recognize
Mhm.
differences, honor differences, and if ever differences are actually the result of injustice or leading to further injustice, to then do something about that.
Mhm. Yeah. And another question that I would like to ask is the forgiveness part as well. And
Mm,
with relationships that you've established, whether, you have varying themes in regards to your book. And
mhm,
a part of that was forgiveness when you have relationships that may not work out, whether that's divorce or
mhm.
broken friendships. So, how would you like a reader to think about forgiveness in a different way?
So just to maybe bring a little bit of more information to the idea. So in the book, I write a bit about my parents' divorce, and that happened when I was a freshman in college. And one of the ways I like to explain the impact of this is that if my book is a book about a search for a sense of belonging, I
Mhm.
I happen to be a person who always felt as though within my family unit that I belonged there, whether or not I necessarily felt that in the broader world, that in my family unit, there was a deep sense of belonging. And so when my parents' marriage fell apart, it almost felt as though the place in which I had belonging no longer existed. And so I think
Mhm.
not even I think, I know it was a deep pain that I felt
Mhm.
in my own experience. And when I think about maybe the idea of forgiveness and moving forward, it's interesting that you say it now because in recent months, I've really been delving into this idea that it's important for us to grieve our losses before we can fully
Yeah.
forgive. And I've
Yeah.
really been exploring that concept. And so I think there were maybe hints of that in the book, but I feel
Mhm.
as though I'm
Mhm.
more in a position today to fully articulate that. And so what I'd want to offer that may even be beyond the book is that when we think about forgiveness, I think there is a sense of also recognizing and naming the losses and
Mhm.
allowing ourselves to grieve those losses,
Mhm.
that we can then fully enter into this idea that actually that experience was hard, but I'm okay. And that's one thing I
Mhm.
talk about in that essay with my parents is
Yeah.
we're okay. We made
Mhm.
this.
And even today, that sense of belonging and going through those stages of grief that we're experiencing right now, also
Mm,
holding on to the fact that we will be okay. We
yeah.
will get through this together. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. And maybe I should have said sense of belonging initially within that question.
Oh no, that's good. It's great.
Are you working on any future books or essays or writings?
So I will say that I would say I'm generally writing, but as for what the project might be specifically, I'm not sure yet. As an essayist, I am writing essays or working on ideas for essays frequently. So I imagine that in the future, some of these essays will come together into a larger project. But in the meantime, I'm feeling good about the fact that I am really delving into my writing again because I'll just say, to be fair, I love this book, love it, but post publication, my personal writing life was not flourishing in quite the way that it was at other points. So again, I love this book, but I'm also thankful that the words are coming back to me again. And
Yeah.
I feel as though I am thriving in the writing again without necessarily feeling as though it has to become the next project.
Yeah. And it's not forced. You're embracing the process of writing. Um,
Right.
will lead to some new endeavor. So we look forward to hearing more of your stories and more of the opportunities that you have forthcoming. And I really just want to thank you for just taking the time to speak with us for this last series today. This has been awesome. I've enjoyed the experience. I hope you have. And I definitely want to encourage everyone to go out and get a copy of this book. You can download it on the library website, but you can also purchase it at Main Street Books and Park Road Books as
Mhm.
well.
Absolutely. Great places. Great places.
Those are great places, and so we would love for people to download your books through the library website. And we also don't want people to forget that there is the book club kit that
Yeah.
people could welcome this opportunity to read your book and have a book club discuss it. So, do you do many book clubs, or have you been invited to
I
any?
have. I have been invited. So
Okay.
yeah, definitely reach out if it's something that your book club might be interested in doing. Actually, someone just asked just the other day if I might possibly be able to join their book club at some point. So please keep
Okay.
that in mind.
Okay. Well, thank you again, Patrice, for participating in Library Foundation's Final Drought Home Edition series. This has been a great opportunity, and I just want to follow up just with some other details about how to support the library. We hope you are using the library more than ever, and we hope that you will continue to support our library. Um, if you would like to give a gift or a donation to the foundation, then the information is foundation.cmlibrary.org. Also, we hope everyone has enjoyed this 10-part series. If you want to go back and catch one of our missed episodes, you can find them all on the Library Foundation's website. Thanks again for joining us tonight. Hope to see you in the library soon. Thank you.